Hello and a very warm welcome back to the France 24 newsroom here in Paris and our special coverage of the UK's first parliamentary elections since the kingdom voted to leave the EU last year. Polling stations up and down the country have just closed their doors and the first exit polls are set to be published in the next few minutes. 650 seats on the iconic green leather benches of the House of Commons are up for grabs. Before we cross live to London for more, let me introduce our guests here this evening. First of all, Agnès Alexandre-Collier, an expert in British politics from the University of Burgundy there in Dijon. Thank you very much for being with us. Of course, we have Alex Taylor also with us, who dubs himself as being a European journalist.
Very much so,
British born and bred as well.
European.
And also with us is Eve Irvine, our Europe editor. Thank you very much all for being with us. But first of all, I think we can cross now live to Westminster, where our reporter Mark Owen is standing by. Mark, what more can you tell us at this hour, this very crucial hour?
We are waiting to find out exactly what these opinion polls, these exit polls are going to say. So until that comes through, I can't really enlighten you anymore. But what I can say is that we think the turnout's been extremely high. We're waiting for official figures on that too. And before voting started, there was an opinion poll putting the Conservative victory, that's what they were saying, at something like 7%. Now, if you spoke to Labour supporters, they'd say that's complete nonsense, it's level pegging. So you kind of like pays your money, takes your choice in terms of which opinion poll you choose to believe. However, someone here with a little bit more insight than I can give you might be able to illuminate us for it. The Conservative MEP for London, Charles Tannock. Charles, thank you very much for being with us. Clearly, you're from the Conservative Party, so we know you're going to tell us that you think this is going to be a clear victory for Theresa May?
I expect so. I mean, I think it would be extraordinary if it weren't. I mean, all the opinion polls, even YouGov, at the end gave a 7% lead, which is higher than in 2015. It would result in a sort of around a 50-60 seat majority, which is a comfortable, clear majority and a strong mandate to govern. So it would be very surprising if anything different were to happen tonight.
Can I play devil's advocate and just say to you, it doesn't matter then that the 24-point lead that Theresa May had when she declared the snap election to reinforce her majority, it doesn't matter that that crumbled away?
Well, listen, as Winston Churchill once said, a majority of one is a majority. And yes, it would be nice to have a landslide. I'm sure Theresa May would be over the moon. But a 60-seat majority is a very comfortable, respectable result in which she will have a clear mandate, a strengthened hand to go forward and negotiate Brexit in the next 11 days when the negotiations start. So I'm, looking at that kind of result. I agree, if it's anything less than 20, then there will be worries that the election was really in vain.
OK, people saying that the campaign was badly handled, but as you're putting it, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. If the majority's there, if the result goes the way that the polls are predicting, all that doesn't matter.
Well, I don't think it was the best election that I witnessed in terms of the campaign from my party. I'm quite old now. I've seen many general election campaigns. This wasn't the most inspiring, and there were some wobbles, and I think some mistakes were made, and lessons need to be drawn, and there needs to be some examination of why certain things happened. But nevertheless, I think ultimately it's a clear choice between Theresa May as Prime Minister and Jeremy Corbyn. And I feel that the British people, the British electorate, will vote for Theresa May. She's by far and away the stronger candidate to be Prime Minister, and it's become a very presidential system here. So I'm confident that we will see Theresa May re-endorsed as Prime Minister for 5 more years.
If things go the way that it looks like they are going, if the pre-vote polls turn out to be right, do you think that the Conservative Party perhaps might take something from the advance that Corbyn made in terms of the policies that many people are worried about, the things that many people are worried about, NHS, for instance, education?
Well, I think Theresa May is clearly, moving in that direction. I mean, we had a manifesto which was not some kind of roar in claw kind of Thatcherite, privatisation, deregulation type manifesto. It's quite clear that she's much more concerned with reaching out to the ordinary working person, protecting their rights. And of course, with Brexit, the economy will be under a lot of pressure. And every effort must be made to make sure that jobs are protected, investments protected, but without the kind of unfunded, uncosted kind of tax rises which Jeremy Corbyn has promised. Basically he's talked about spending 30 billion on the NHS. Who's going to pay for it?
OECD in Paris warning that a hard Brexit would be disastrous.
Well, I think it will be. I mean, I'm a passionate pro-European. It's quite difficult for me to even talk about Brexit in such terms, but we are where we are. I accept that Brexit's happening. I've campaigned for a softer Brexit, and one of my biggest hopes is that Theresa May, with her own mandate, she will be confident enough to face down the hardliners within the Conservative Party, the kind of UKIP-type individuals who want the hardest Brexit, and she will be able to compromise and accommodate and actually come up with a good deal for Britain.
Indeed, worth reminding people that Theresa May was, at the beginning, a Remainer. Charles, thank you very much indeed, sir. Charles Saddock, MEP, Conservative Party for London. Lots more to discuss, of course. I'm awaiting for those first exit polls to come through. Back to you in the studio.
Mark Owen, outside Big Ben there in Westminster, thank you very much for that update. I can just tell viewers who are tuning into our coverage here on France 24 that one exit poll just published projects that the Conservatives under Theresa May have bagged themselves 314 of those 650 seats in the House of Commons. But other opinion polls, not so sure. Yves Irvine, our Europe editor, talk us through that confusion.
Well, we're just waiting, obviously, for those results to come true. Polling booths have just closed their doors a few minutes ago, but we're seeing the first exit poll from British media, and it does suggest that Theresa May's gamble has not paid off. It looks like she has lost a number of seats in the British Parliament. 314 seats they're giving her in that 650 seat total. The outgoing one, the one that was in place until she called these snap elections in April, had 330 seats. They had a 17-seat working majority. She was hoping to extend on that at one point, thinking she would take a landslide of 100 seats. We just heard from a British MEP from the Conservative Party saying, he still expected at least 50. Anything under 20 would be, a sign that these elections had been called in vain, a bit of a waste of time, a bit of a waste of money. And time is not on the UK side, because those Brexit negotiations, time is ticking. And now, if these exit polls are to be confirmed, it's a very bad night indeed for Theresa May and her party. Labour, however, according to the same results, gaining a few seats, up 266. It had previously been on 229. Of course, exit results, nothing confirmed yet. But if we have a hung parliament, if Theresa May doesn't have that majority, then we got to look at what happens next. One, there's the option of a coalition government, but that's not really in UK history to do that, not really a habit over there. We did have it, I believe it was 2010 with the Lib Dems, and it's something the Liberal Democrats have said they don't want to repeat, so that's out of the question. We could say a minority government, but then going into Brexit negotiations, a minority government where you don't have the same guarantee that Parliament will pass what you're proposing in terms of laws and policies. That's not a very comfortable position. And of course, we could have a third option. The UK might have to go back to the polls again.
Indeed. Yves Irvine, thank you very much for now. I want to bring in both of our guests and ask them the same question. How do you both, if these exit polls are to be believed, how do we account for Theresa May's loss here and not securing a majority? What went wrong in her campaign?
I think we ought to say also that this is the BBC exit poll, the one that got Brexit wrong. I remember I was here on the evening of a year ago for the Brexit referendum, and the British political system, because it's 630 constituencies, and each one has its own particular story and its first past the post. So it's very hard to predict on a kind of a general swing which seats are going to go which way. But if this is the case, this is an absolute disaster for Theresa May. She hasn't even got an absolute majority. I think she will probably, if this is the case, if she has got 314, because she called this election thinking she was going to get an absolute landslide. There was no need to call this election. There was talk of getting 180 seats when she called the election. If she's only got 316, she hasn't even got a majority, then she will resign tomorrow morning, which throws the whole Brexit question into doubt, because what's going to happen with Brexit? I mean, Theresa May can now not go to Brussels if this is the case, but I'm very sceptical. I think we'll end up with something like a 40 or 50 majority. I mean, this is, if this is the case, this is what the BBC are saying, and it turns out to be correct during the night, Theresa May has to resign tomorrow. She took a gamble when she didn't have to. Huge gamble. And she's had such a disastrous campaign. She's lost all kind of credibility. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. I was in Britain over the weekend, and my stepmother, who I always listen to, usually votes Conservative. She lives in a very well-off part of Sussex. But she said to me, Alex, for the first time, I didn't vote for the Conservatives because they said that if I get dementia, they're going to take my house away. I mean, it was a disastrous campaign. Maybe we're seeing the results, but it certainly have huge implications if this is the case. But I'd take it with a pinch of salt, because I remember the BBC said that Brexit had lost, and they got that wrong too. Yeah.
OK, let's also bring in Alexandre-Collier from the University of Burgundy. How do you account, if these polls are to be believed, how do you account for this massive loss here for Theresa May's Conservatives?
I think I agree with what Alex said. I think Theresa May would need to resign quite immediately, because it would be a massive disaster for the Conservative Party, especially as she announced the snap election and really thought that it would be a landslide victory at the end of it. 395 seats were predicted originally. So
can we say that the country punished her for Brexit, or was it her stance on national security? Was it more the rise of the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, who surged in polls in recent weeks?
I think there are three reasons mainly. The first is that she actually led a disastrous campaign, formally and substantially. Formally because, in fact, she didn't take part in the television debates. For example, she sent her Home Secretary instead of really having to discuss with other party leaders. And the second point is that she made a series of U-turns, for example, on pensioners, for example, and other important decisions like Brexit, for example. So that's clearly one reason, and the other reason is that clearly Jeremy Corbyn, who was constantly stigmatised and demonised in the Conservative press, have had quite a massive support, not necessarily in the Labour Party, because the parliamentary party is quite at odds with the leader at the moment, but among voters and among supporters and registered supporters of the Labour Party, there's quite an enthusiasm for at least the figure and the symbol of a left-wing radical leader. Even though he's not seen as clearly electable and a potential prime minister, he's quite charismatic for them. So it's a combination of reasons mainly, but the key reason being the failure of Theresa May.
I think she's proved herself to be totally uncharismatic as well. I mean,
exactly.
under pressure, she's never been under pressure before. She didn't even have to go through a competition in order to become. She simply did it by default because everybody else said, well, I don't want to be Prime Minister. And the thing we've seen through this campaign is, under questioning, the rare times that she did agree to go on television, she just produces robotic phrases like strong and stable leadership, and she's become very robotic. And
although when she called the election back in April, she was riding high in the polls.
Yes, because she'd never been put under test.
She was Home Secretary, and on the issues of national security that have come to the forefront in this campaign, after the attacks in Manchester and in London, have come to dominate this vote.
Yes, but I mean, she hasn't really been able to put them forward very much because she's very weak on that, because she did suppress or get rid of 20,000 policemen. So she's very weak on questions of security. She can't stand up and say, I am strong and stable against terrorism, because it's very easy for the opposition to say, well, why did you get rid of 20,000 policemen? Which they did. It's been a very hard campaign for her. But once again, I'm sceptical. I think we're writing her off, unfortunately, too soon, because I mean, if this is true, this is absolutely catastrophic.
Well, the wires are falling here in the France 24 newsroom, and all of them are saying a projected loss here for the Conservative
Party. And again, I
think
just another point. If you look at surveys listing the main issues for voters, in fact, what you have is Brexit comes first, and then health, and then immigration. And health was clearly a divisive issue.
Because it's huge in Britain. I mean, my stepmom was very worried because she has to wait 3 weeks before she gets a doctor.
I have to interrupt us. We actually have to now go straight back to Westminster, where our reporter Mark Owen is following events for us. Mark, do we have any clarity yet about these confusing wires we're getting here in the France 24 newsroom about these exit polls? Do you have any more clarity on these early results?
I love that word, clarity. At this point, there is no clarity at all. But what we are seeing and what we are hearing is that the gamble by Theresa May that she took back in mid-April when she was on that walking holiday, then she had some serendipitous moment, decided she would call a snap election in order to reinforce her hand, to give her a bigger majority to take into Brexit negotiations. That appears to have backfired in a regal fashion. Just to let people know who are watching this, perhaps expecting big crowds behind us here at Parliament, the system here in this country, of course, is one of constituencies. Theresa May is at her constituency outside of London, Jeremy Corbyn at his in central North London. So they'll be having their little parties or little commiseration ceremonies going on as we speak. But of course, we're still waiting to see exactly what this result will mean. As it looks like the Conservatives will be the largest party, short of an overall majority. Labour, clearly the winners of the night, have moved within reach. And then if you stack all the other parties together and put them in with Labour, well, there you've got a coalition government. So that's the size of things. We could be seeing Jeremy Corbyn as the Prime Minister. And it isn't that long ago that everybody was saying this is not entirely possible. If you'd bought the newspapers here in the UK this morning, most of them were completely lampooning Jeremy Corbyn, calling him for everything, and I'm not exaggerating. I could show you some horrible pages, horrible cartoons, and in some cases, well, downright lies in many ways. This kind of character assassination is sadly typical of certain parts of the British press, and the press leaning towards the right, the media in the UK also leaning towards the right. Even the BBC was criticised for being anti-Jeremy Corbyn. Now, all that, of course, seems to have come home to roost. It seems the people have spoken in a different way. OK, so Conservatives, largest party, short of the majority. This is clearly a gamble that seems to have backfired for Theresa May. What are the issues that people have been talking about and concerned about? Well, clearly the future of the National Health Service is something that is very dear to all people here in the United Kingdom. Talk of the UK or just break it up into the separate countries. Everybody, I think, across the whole of the nation is worried about issues like that. So public spending a big issue, education another large issue too, and clearly the number of young people who registered and maybe came out to vote today might have been very crucial.
Mark Owen in Westminster there. I'm going to take a brief pause. We'll come back to you very shortly. I just want to remind our viewers of the latest here in the France 24 newsroom. We're hearing that the pound is tumbling as those exit polls suggest that Britain is on course for a hung parliament as the British Prime Minister, the British Conservative Prime Minister, seems to have failed to reach an overall majority after this Thursday's general election, the first since the country voted to leave the EU. These live pictures I want to show you now come from Sunderland in the northeast of England. That's, of course, one of the very first constituencies, historically the first constituency to declare its official results. We'll be going back there, I'm sure, very shortly. But Mark, I'm guessing you've been out and about speaking to some voters there in London this Thursday. What have they been saying?
Excuse me, Thomas. I heard what you said. I was just clearing my throat because you know me, I've been talking to people all the time, it's the way I am, and everybody you speak to, they seem to be coming up with similar concerns about how the country is, how the country's going, and these fears concern what happens to things like the National Health Service and the future of education in this country, because, you know, everybody has been through those kind of two public areas, and they are concerned about the way things might go afterwards, and what the future for that might be. Now, clearly, there have been rumours for many years about the privatisation of the National Health Service, something that could prove to be very lucrative for certain people who could get hold of that and maybe establish some kind of a US, American-style system, which, of course, many people here in the United Kingdom would be extremely against. Just to remind people who maybe don't know how things work in the United Kingdom, healthcare is free at the point of supply. You don't have a problem with that. You go there. You don't need to be rich. You don't need to be moneyed. You don't even need health insurance. You turn up, you get treated. That's the way it is. And that's something that was created back in 1948 to create a place where people could be healthy and lead good, healthy lives and continue to strive and achieve. And then alongside with that went education, which was free to everybody. That, of course, was changed under the previous Labour government, who introduced student loans. This is something that Jeremy Corbyn outright said, student loans finished. People have debts, will be excused, and we go on with that. And that's probably something which might have made a lot of younger people get off their backsides and come out and vote today.
Mark Owen in central London, thank you very much for that update. For those of you just tuning in to France 24, a quick reminder of our main story this hour. The early exit polls from Thursday's general election in the UK show that Theresa May is short of an overall majority. She's set to win, according to that exit poll, 314 seats in Parliament, according, of course, to those early predictions. These aren't, of course, official results. Vote counting will carry on throughout the night until Friday. But Eve Irvine, our Europe editor, the Wise here talking about a hung parliament. That is, of course, not what was expected.
No, it's not what was expected. It's possibly the worst case scenario both for the UK and for the EU when it comes to their Brexit negotiations. A hung parliament means, 3 scenarios possible. A coalition government, that's not really what's done in the UK. Minority government, one that doesn't have the automatic backing of a parliament at a time when it has literally thousands of new policies and legislations to try and push to Parliament with a deadline of March 2019 to have an agreement with 27 heads of state in the EU or not, to leave with nothing, or gear up for more elections. And I certainly get the feeling, even from this side of the channel, that the British are pretty sick of voting at this stage.
Oh yes, they wouldn't do it again. No, for somebody who's ardently pro-Remain and will fight till the death for thinking that Britain is better off in the European Union, this is fantastic news because it's a vote against Brexit. It's simply that. I mean, if the British public was so enthusiastic about Brexit, they would have given Theresa May 160 majority as she thought. This is far from it. They've not even given her, if these, once again, exit polls are to be believed, and I take them with a pinch of salt, but if this turns out to be the case, Theresa May, first of all, has no credibility left whatsoever. She didn't have to call this election. It was a pure gamble. She decided to do it on a rambling weekend with her husband because she thought she could get 160 majority. She hasn't even got a majority. It's got less seats than before. You need 326 seats to get a majority in the British Parliament. So if these figures turn out, not only can she not defend her Brexit and her view of hard Brexit, I don't think she can even lead her party or be Prime Minister anymore. She has to resign tomorrow. David Cameron resigned the next day because of the Brexit referendum.
Very briefly, Article 50 has been pushed. How does that change things?
Article 50 has been triggered on the 29th of March, and that gives a 2-year negotiation period between the UK and the EU. But technically, according to the author of that article, and I've read the 300 words numerous times, there's nothing that says, it's very short, it's quite easy, but there's nothing in that says it's not reversible. So technically, the UK, until the 29th of March 2019, can get on a plane and go to Brussels and say, sorry, we've changed our mind.
But who's going to be able to defend it now? Who is going to be able to stand up instead of Theresa May and say, the British people have still voted for Brexit? They haven't.
But both of the main parties at the same time, Tory and Labour, both said, the people have spoken, we may not like it, we've campaigned Remain, but Brexit is going to happen.
But this has decredibilised the whole of that thing because you've got a lot of Remainers in the Tories and half the Labour Party were for Remain, and so they're now going to have wind in their sails to say we didn't vote for Theresa May's hard version of Brexit. She didn't get a majority. We have to stop this whole process. If this is true, the Remainers are suddenly going to start to fight back as from now on.
And perhaps one diplomatic option could be to have what the Liberal Democrats had proposed, for what the SNP had called for, was to have a vote on the deal that the UK would have with the EU.
But who's going to go negotiate? I can't see anybody can go now to Brussels. If this is true, nobody in 9 days' time, the negotiations are supposed to start in Brussels. Who can now go and say, I represent the will of the British people? Because everybody around the table is going to know that's not the case.
Just perhaps a quick point on the hung parliament, because there are 2 options mainly. The first is that the Conservative Party tries to find allies in the House of Commons, and the only potential ally, if you look back to 2010, for example, when there was a coalition government with the Liberal Democrats, it's the Liberal Democrat Party.
We're hearing in the White House that they're saying it would be really hard for them to form a coalition.
Of course, because they want a second referendum on Brexit.
And Liberal Democrats are the only party who are against Brexit, so they're not going to go with the Conservatives.
And Labour will probably look in the direction of the SNP, but then again, on the question of the British Union, the United Kingdom, they are very divided. So it's going to be very complicated for both parties.
This puts Brexit totally in doubt. If this is true...
Do you think there'll be another general election?
I think that there will have to be. I don't see how any Conservative leader can now credibly say, I'm going to Brussels and I'm going to defend Brexit, because this is an absolute catastrophe for the Conservative Party. I mean, it's historic.
But that said, Jeremy Corbyn hasn't won either. Where does that leave him? He's kind of made gains, but not quite enough.
Depends on how many seats the SNP will get, for example.
Okay.
If they form a solid group, around 50 seats.
Because the Labour Party and the SNP together could form a coalition, and the SNP would drag that coalition into being very, very anti-Brexit. So Jeremy Corbyn would find it hard to keep his coalition together if he maintains, because he was supposed to be for Remain. Everybody knows that secretly he wanted to leave the European Union, but he did actually campaign for Remain. And over half of his MPs in the Labour Party, without even talking about the SNPs, who were rabidly pro-European. If the Labour Party now gets a hint of the idea that they can campaign to stay in the European Union, I think this has turned the whole situation. I mean, perhaps it's just wishful thinking, but this is, once again, if this turns out to be right, but once again, their Brexit poll was wrong. I came here
we should be really cautious
on Brexit, and I was smiling like this, saying, we're staying in the European Union. I came here again at 6 o'clock in the morning. I had a totally different face. Things can change overnight. It's very hard to predict. But what we can see with this poll is that it's not 150 majority as she was expecting, and that already is enormous.
But in terms of these exit polls, in the past, they tend to be quite accurate, don't they? They've very rarely been wrong in recent years.
For general elections, it is hard to tell, though, because what you're measuring with an exit poll is a general tendency in the country.
Exactly.
And because it's a first-past-the-post system, in each constituency, it's often very close. So and it depends on the local personality. So it's not because there's a general tendency in Britain to go one way or the other that each seat will go that way. You might not like the particular candidate. So it's all...
That's a good point to point out. Even if you get, say, 12% of the overall vote, you won't get 12% of the seats in Parliament in the British system.
You need to have seat projections in constituencies.
We sadly have to pause once again and go straight back to central London, where our reporter Mark Owen is standing by there live. Mark, we're talking more and more here in the newsroom of a potential hung Parliament there. What more can you tell us?
I'm glad you didn't ask me for clarity, Thomas, because there's no more clarity coming through. I'm listening to what you've been saying, and I'd like to get Eve's take on the idea of what Jeremy Corbyn actually stands for, what he's looking for. He wants to stay in the single market, he wants to stay in the customs union. How would that differ from just like staying in the European Union itself? That's something I'd like to hear Eve maybe elaborate on in a few moments' time. Let me tell you what people are kind of saying around here. There's an eerie quiet around Parliament because all the MPs, of course, are away in their own constituencies, awaiting their fate, hearing how they got on tonight. And, of course, but this news that the Conservatives are the largest party, but it seems to be the largest losers tonight, has really taken everybody by surprise. You were talking about the opinion polls. Well, YouGov, who said in the last poll before polling day, yesterday, that the Tories would win by 7 points, seem to have been proved wrong, just as they were proved wrong over the Brexit referendum too. So one is beginning to ask, what is the use of these opinion polls? What purpose do they serve? And how can they ever be trusted? Because it seems in recent times there have been mistake after mistake after mistake. But democracy, what a wonderful thing. Here we go with a system which now seems to have thrown up a leader who everybody seems to vilify, who the press in the UK have pulled apart and mounted their own campaign against ever since he was elected leader of the Labour Party. In fact, at one point, half of his MPs didn't want him to be actually the leader of that party. He seemed to have proved them all wrong, grown in stature, and it seems gained more and more backing. So the Labour Party looking like the winners tonight, but of course, as you've all rightly pointed out, in order to govern, there needs to be some kind of coalition that's created. And of course, with the Scottish National Party's support with the Labour Party, that would again push towards some kind of pro-European stance, throw other parties into the mix too, and clearly it changes the perspective, because clearly if the Northern Irish parties go along with the Labour Party as well, again, Northern Ireland wants to stay in the European Union. It really has changed the whole way that Britain may be looking at these upcoming Brexit negotiations. It could be extremely interesting, could it not?
Mark Owen in central London, thank you very much for that update. Eve Irvine, do you want to answer Mark's question there?
Well, actually, once the UK voted to leave the EU, there was a running joke in Brussels saying, well, before the UK was in the EU with lots of opt-outs, now it appears to be wanting to be out with lots of opt-ins. And at the end of the day, what they're looking for is more of the same. Jeremy Corbyn, for his part, I mean, I think that was partially one of people's frustrations with the Labour Party in this election as well, is they still don't know exactly what kind of Brexit he would like. One thing he kept saying is he would not be the hard, punitive, attacking British Prime Minister going to those Brussels negotiations. He was looking for a consensus. He differed very much to Theresa May when he said no deal for him was the absolute worst case scenario, where she had repeatedly said no deal was better than a bad deal. Maybe that was the biggest difference between the two. He wanted access to the single market to ensure that the customs union, she had said they were walking away from everything.
But his problem is that his electors, Labour, his electors, Labour electors are split down the middle. I mean, half Labour electors voted to Brexit and half, so he can't go out. It's very difficult for him and say we're for this or that. I mean, his compromise position was to say that he respects the result of the referendum, but over half of his MPs, easily 70% of his MPs, were against Brexit. What's really interesting in the poll that you've just put up, if you do the maths, I just did the maths, it's 314 for the Conservatives and 314 for Labour, the Scottish Nationalists and the Lib Dem. That is just incredible.
Unheard
that
of,
means it's like the Conservatives are exactly the same number as the three major kind of like opposition parties put together. That is enormous. I mean, that's an incredible story if that's the case, because that will leave Britain totally rudderless at the moment. I mean, who can possibly be Prime Minister under those circumstances? It totally throws into question the direction of British politics if once again it's anywhere near what we're predicting.
If you can try and guess, what are Theresa May's thoughts at this very second?
I have to resign. I don't have the confidence. I thought I was going to get 150. I called this election for no reason whatsoever, which I decided over a weekend when I went hiking with my husband, because according to the opinion polls, I thought I could get 150 majority. That's why I did it. There was no need to call this election. She did it. She gambled. She lost. She has to go.
In the same way as David Cameron gambled and lost.
Yeah. He went the very next morning. At 8 o'clock the next morning, he'd resigned. If this is true, I can predict that Theresa May, if she doesn't resign, she will be forced to resign by Saturday by her party. They will say, "Why did you put us through this? We had a majority in the House of Commons. You've lost the majority." She, and also with her vision of hard Brexit has died this evening of the last half hour. Absolutely, certainly. I'm delighted about it. I hope it's true. But once again, let's make sure that these predictions are the same tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock, because I'm a little bit dubious about that.
Okay, I'm just going to very quickly remind our viewers of our top story this hour. The Bond fight for seats in Westminster has come to an end. The early exit polls from the BBC, from Sky News, suggest that the current Prime Minister, the Conservative Prime Minister, Theresa May, has failed to win a parliamentary majority, with 314 of those seats in Westminster, if those exit polls are, of course, to be believed. The ballot papers are being counted throughout the night. We will have official results later on Friday morning. And the former FBI Director James Comey gives his version of events about why he was sacked at his hearing before Congress. He says he was shown the door by Donald Trump in order to change the way the Bureau's investigation into Russia's alleged meddling in last November's presidential vote was conducted. We can now cross back live to Westminster, where our reporter Mark Owen is standing by. Mark, tell us more from where you are.
There is a sense of shell shock here at the news that the Conservatives haven't won a majority, it seems, if the exit polls are to be believed. 314 seats, 266 for the Labour Party. You add up the others, you get a coalition perhaps led by Jeremy Corbyn, which is something that most people in the UK were led to believe, if you read the press, would be an absolute disaster for the country. We hear that the pound has plummeted on the news of this election result, although of course nothing is as yet confirmed. Where this leaves the UK in Europe, out of Europe, somewhere across the two, with maybe a foot in both camps, we don't know yet. That's obviously something that will be sort of resolved within the future. But I think, just going back to one or two things that the panel was saying there in the studio, people's attitudes here in the UK seem to have changed since the Brexit referendum. Remember, of course, many people feel that they were told blatant lies by the Brexit campaigners. For instance, the £350 million per week, which would be not sent to Europe, but actually brought back and spent on the NHS. Nigel Farage, of course, the bastion of Brexit, was the man who then said, oops, well, maybe that's not going to be working that way. And then, of course, he decided to bow out of politics. David Cameron decided to resign. And there you go. So many people, I think, now doubting the very wisdom of that referendum and whether, of course, the UK should leave. Of course, many are still die-hard leavers.
And Mark, of course, as you said there, if we add up Labour, Lib Dem, SNP, we do have a coalition that's on the same level as the Conservatives. Of course, the Conservatives are currently, if these polls are to be believed, in the lead with 314, but no absolute majority. Who, though, would want to work with the Tories?
It's a very good question, and I don't have any answers to that kind of a question, I must admit. It's a tricky one, isn't it? Do we have to reform the electoral system in the UK? Do we need to bring in proportional representation? Do we need to look at a different way of electing our government? Maybe that's something that maybe needs to be looked at in the future. But how do we get through this crisis right now? That is the question. I don't have any answers to that. But what I do see are natural alliances forming between, say, the Labour Party, the Scottish Nationalists, the Greens will throw their weight in. It's only one MP at present, but who knows, maybe there'll be two. You add a few smaller parties in as well. Maybe Plaid Cymru will go in with the Labour Party as well. You then create some kind of a coalition that is possibly viable and could work. Who would work with the Tories? Well, there's at least one party in Ulster that would consider that, I'm sure. And then after that, where'd you go? It's a tricky one, isn't it? I think the likely outcome is some kind of a coalition led by the Labour government, led by Labour, with Jeremy Corbyn as the Prime Minister, which is something that the British press this morning, almost across the board, except for two newspapers, were considering would be a complete disaster for the country. But many, of course, disagree.
Mark Owen in central London, thank you very much. I want to just quickly show our viewers watching at this hour vote counting clearly underway there. I'm not too sure where that is. It could be Sunderland. I may be told differently, but I think that's Sunderland in the northeast of the UK. That's, of course, one of the very, very first, or traditionally the first constituency or constituencies to give their official results. Of course, if these exit polls are to be believed, Theresa May in for a quite dramatic loss. Her gamble there has paid off. Eva Vine, if talking about Brexit, that was clearly one of the main election issues this time around. Supposed to be, but you may say it was overshadowed by other things.
Well, when Theresa May called these snap elections back in April, she justified that by saying she needed a stronger mandate from the British Parliament. She needed that strength to go with a solid hand to those negotiations in Brussels. But in the 7 weeks of campaigning, I didn't really hear Brexit mentioned at all. I definitely didn't hear any details on what kind of Brexit they were going to have, details on the financial side of things, the immigration side of things, nothing more than the slogan details that we'd already heard, that it would be a hard Brexit, that no deal was better than a bad deal, that she would curb immigration. All very vague details, and it wasn't really a leading topic.
Alex Taylor, have voters this time around, if these polls are to be believed, punished Theresa May as a politician or punished the Conservative Party and the legacy of David Cameron in terms of the whole Brexit debate that he opened?
No, I think it's very much about Theresa May. I mean, she's the one who decided to call this election for no apparent reason, who said...
But it was on the back of Brexit, nevertheless.
Well, yes, but Brexit really wasn't a theme because my reading is that Brexit, both parties know that Brexit is going to be very bad for the UK economically, at least in the short term, probably in the long term, and I think definitively badly. So that's why neither party wanted to talk particularly about the specifics of Brexit. If you asked Theresa May, what are your real Brexit plans? The only reply she gave in a robotic manner was, I want to get the best deal for Britain. But it doesn't mean anything. People don't know what that means. People don't know what it means when she said, which she said quite a lot, that no deal is better than a bad deal. And people pressed her on that and say, well, no deal means that we'll go to world trade rules, which means that half the products in our supermarkets are going to have 40% tariffs on them. But nobody actually explained what that means. I think what Mark said is very true too. You have to remember that Britain has one thing that no other country in Europe has, which is an incredibly biased press. 85% of the articles on the Brexit referendum were against the European Union. I would say about 75-80% of articles during this election have been against Jeremy Corbyn and for Theresa May. Britain has an incredibly pro-right-wing, pro-Brexit press. And if the results here, this is quite astounding because this will be the first time that the Sun didn't predict the winner. The Sun always, and the Sun came out with a massive pun today about don't put Britain in the core bin.
But he's done better than expected.
He's done much better than expected. But also, it must be said, I've been watching him too. For the first time also over this campaign, he's actually got fair time. Because up until recently, in the press, practically all the press just trashes him. And even on the television, the BBC and other channels, I've worked for them, they take their news agenda from the press. So they put in their news bulletins what the press says about Corbyn. And during an election campaign, you have to be fairer. You have to give him the same time as Theresa May. So people have listened to him. And he did have much more energy. I mean, perhaps also because he came from so low. Nobody expected him to do well at all. So the expectations were so low.
It's going to be very difficult for him because you've got the Labour leader and you've got the parliamentary party. And they're two very different things. So it's going to be quite isolated in the House of Commons because probably most MPs are still Blairite.
But I think they're going to become more Corbynite now. If he's done this, they'll suddenly find him much more sympathetic. But who knows? And
Agnes, just on that point, we're seeing Labour predicted to get 260 seats, according to this poll. 266, yeah. According to those early exit polls. How do you account for that massive surge in Jeremy Corbyn's popularity? A few weeks ago, he was seen as this kind of like loony lefty, no chance of winning, and now he's really hot on the tails of Theresa May here.
But remember how he was elected Labour leader. It was a very strange procedure because, in fact, usually the Labour leader was elected by MPs, members and trade unions. And Ed Miliband, who was the former leader, changed the procedure. And this time there were registered supporters who participated in the procedure in 2015. And so there was a momentum. This was the name of the movement he gathered around him, a group of supporters who were not full members of the Labour Party who supported Corbyn. So he's got this sort of grassroots support in the country, which is perhaps much more important than what happens in the House of Commons. So this justifies probably this would justify the victory of the Labour Party.
And I think also he was successful in pulling attention in this campaign over to Labour kind of topics like the welfare benefits, giving 75 billion to save the NHS, to take away children.
It doesn't really affect people. Yeah. I mean, I often talk about my stepmother on this programme, but she's much more affected by the price of apples. I was in
bread and butter
Britain this weekend, and she said, Alex, I paid £3 for 6 apples in the supermarket this weekend. And for her, that's much more important than Brexit.
How many people in the UK think like her? How much?
Practically everybody. They're all concerned about inflation. They're all concerned about the fact that if you go to the doctors because of Tory cuts, you now have to wait 3 weeks before you get a doctor appointment. These are things that, whether they're to do with Brexit or not, affect people. And Jeremy Corbyn put these on the agenda rather than Brexit. And that's why people were thinking, well, first of all, do we really want to vote for Theresa May after her robotic performance, but also do we want to go through for 5 years more of Tory cuts when the country is already suffering quite a lot from them? I think these were bigger issues.
And clearly you had almost two caricatural leaders, with Theresa May being very haughty and very almost contemptuous in a way, when she refused to participate in the debates. And Jeremy Corbyn, who appeared to be humane, close to the people, talking about bread and butter issues instead of...
Did Theresa May forget those issues, do you think, in her campaign?
No, I don't think she forgot about them, but she wasn't as outspoken. And I do really think that it was the bread and butter issues. And you mentioned it earlier, Alex, the dementia tax. I was in England, actually, in the week before this and the week after, and you could see the shift was like overnight. The mood changed. It was suddenly... What has she proposed? She wanted elderly people to pay for their own care if they
got dementia or Alzheimer's, but not cancer for some reason, and not Parkinson's. Only people who got... I mean, it's so unfair. Well. My stepmother, once again, said to me this weekend, for the first time, she voted Liberal Democrat because she usually votes Conservative. But she said, I think that's totally unfair because my father got dementia.
And it was the U-turn on it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, and she said, well, why would I vote for anybody who's going to take my house away?
But again, about Brexit, I read a YouGov survey saying that British people are still massively supportive of Brexit nowadays, like what you said. I mean, they're very pleased with the verdict.
Well, it was only 52.
Even though it's,
Yeah, but and quite a lot of people have said, well...
But they're divided on the kind of...
But I think now people will start saying, this is not a vote for Brexit. This is not a vote at all which is in any way, by anybody be interpreted as being the British people are massively in favour of Brexit. Otherwise, they would have given Theresa May the majority that she rightfully should have got.
But officially, both leaders are in favour of Brexit. I mean, it's only hard Brexit and soft Brexit.
It depends on what kind.
And I have to say, there is that feeling also in the UK, though, that a lot of people who even voted Remain do now accept that, the majority voted Brexit. And there was a willingness to move on with it. And even when I was there, before the dementia tax and social issues came up more, there was a lot of people saying, well, actually, they were called Relievers, I believe, who voted Remain, were now saying, look, we've got ourselves into this, and now it's up to the Tories to deal with the problem.
But that's taken a massive defeat this evening, because apparently it hasn't gone that way. This is going to put the whole of the Brexit... Who's going to take over the Brexit strategy now? Because even if Jeremy Corbyn becomes Prime Minister, which I still think is very unlikely, then he's in coalition with Nicola Sturgeon, who wants Scotland to be independent and to remain in the EU. I mean, and also the Greens were totally pro-EU and half his own party.
Maybe the Lib Dems this time. Maybe the Lib Dems this time.
The Lib Dems,
needed as well to make up the seats.
Just in that point in time, of course, is ticking in Brussels.
No, absolutely.
When are those negotiations meant to begin?
They were supposed to start on the 19th of June. That's the date that Michel Barnier, the Brussels main negotiator, had suggested, thinking that gave time for the UK elections to pass off peacefully. But now we're not expecting them for a number of weeks, given this election. I mean, results, if there's no solid Prime Minister to represent the UK, you can't really start talks. And then very soon we're into Germany's general elections, which will also delay talks, and that deadline of March 29, 2019 is not going to move.
But let's wait until 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, because I find it's very hard to believe.
We should remind our viewers, these are, of course, very, very early exit polls, and they could be wrong, but of course they have been wrong in the past. Just want to remind our viewers, the latest pictures here of vote counting underway, I believe, in Sunderland in the northeast of the United Kingdom following Thursday's general election, the first since the country voted to leave the European Union last year. We can cross back once again live to our reporter Mark Owen, who I believe has a special guest with him. Mark, tell us more.
Special guest indeed, someone who is neutral but has opinions, and we're going to need to hear these opinions. Catherine Barnard is a professor of EU law from Cambridge University. Thank you for being with us. Your reaction to this result, Catherine, which clearly throws a number of things into disarray in terms of how things were supposed to be. The Tories are meant to win by 7 points and have a majority of 50 to 100 seats. Apparently not the case, if we believe what we've heard so far.
Absolutely. Theresa May held this election for two reasons. One, she thought she could beat Jeremy Corbyn and beat him hard, and secondly, to give herself a decent majority so she could get any bill through Parliament or any deal that she negotiated with the European Union through Parliament. And the fact is, if she hasn't got the absolute majority, and that's what the exit polls are saying, then that puts her into quite a difficult position, because she's weakened because she hasn't delivered on the two principal objectives, and also it sends out a message of weakness to the European Union negotiators. Now, I was in Brussels last week, and they were saying actually they weren't that bothered what sort of majority she'd got, but it's really important internally within her party. And so negotiations are due to start in 11 days' time on the 19th of June. There's a big question, first of all, will she still be leader? If she's not still leader, what's going to happen? Nevertheless, we need that time, because the clock's been ticking and the countdown is already well underway. We've got 2 years to negotiate an exit deal, and that is not looking very positive at the moment.
So yesterday, both major parties, Conservative, Labour, said that they respected the result of the referendum. The Tories for their own reasons, Labour for their reasons too. Are things kind of like changed now in some way, do you think?
No, Brexit's going to happen, that's clear. But what's less clear is what sort of Brexit we're talking about. Are we talking about the hardest of hard Brexits, which may mean just falling back on WTO rules, which would not be necessarily in the best interest of the United Kingdom, because WTO rules deal with tariffs, but not all the stuff on regulation, so-called non-tariff barriers? Or actually, should we be going for something of a softer Brexit, which may mean some compromises? Now, one reading of what's happened tonight is actually the public is saying they want a sort of middle ground. Brexit's going to happen, but perhaps not the hardest of hard Brexits, which is what some of the people on the right of the Tory party have been pushing for.
So in terms of what it looks like Labour's Jeremy Corbyn could be the next leader of the country. In terms of what he's been saying, what the Labour Party's been saying, they're looking to stay within the single market, take advantage of that, stay within the customs union. Basically, it sounds like staying within the EU.
Well, it's odd, isn't it? Because, it's not clear. I think Theresa May is still more likely to be the Prime Minister in the next few days. But Jeremy Corbyn was sending out conflicting messages. Yes, he said he wants to stay in the single market, but he also said he wants to control migration. And those two do not sit together. You have one or the other. You can't have both. Now, it may be that he's got a cunning plan, and his cunning plan might be that we try and opt out of some aspect of the single market for a period of time while immigration is got, in their view, under control. Or it may be that he really wants to have his cake and eat it. And indeed, of course, that's a famous slogan that Boris Johnson has used as well, Boris Johnson being for the Conservative Party.
Well, maybe his cake becomes a gâteau and he enjoys being in Europe. It could be an interesting thing. In terms of, though, what happens next, I mean, you say the negotiations are obviously coming up in the middle of June, and it's really important for the UK to be, well, to have its act sort of sorted out, to know where it's going, to know what it wants.
Absolutely. The EU has actually been really very impressive. The EU has put out a lot of impressive documentation, simple, clear, transparent, about what they want.
And everybody criticises the EU, saying it's all bureaucracy, but this is actually sort of proving people are wrong.
It is, because they've been very clear that there is going to be 3 phases of the negotiation process. Phase 1 to start next week, in 11 days' time. Phase 1 is looking at citizens' rights, so that's the right of EU citizens in the UK and British citizens in countries like France.
It concerns most people at France 24. There we go.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's also about the Northern Ireland border, and it's about money. And that's Phase 1, and the EU has said we will not progress to deal with anything more until the Phase 1 issues have been sorted out. And the money's the big one, because the money might be a Brexit fee, as some people call it, the liabilities of 60 billion euros, but the French have been very effectively opening every drawer and thinking there's some money that could be owed there, and actually now talking about 100 billion. And of course, to the British press, this is just unacceptable. And so there is a reasonable chance, 50-50 chance, I think, that the negotiations will collapse pretty quickly. And then that leaves us in the UK in a really very difficult position.
So a very queer street indeed. You mentioned the press. Were you shocked at how the press in Britain was really virulently anti-Jeremy Corbyn in the run-up to this election?
Of course, we have to be careful when we about generalising. Certain parts of the press were virulently anti-Corbyn.
I'll say it for you. The Guardian, The Mirror today weren't, and they seem to be quite balanced.
Absolutely.
I read The Sun, which was practically atrocious. I read the Daily Mail, that was almost as bad. And even the Daily Telegraph had a former head of MI6 talking about Jeremy Corbyn, saying that he isn't fit to lead the country because he couldn't make it into the security service because he wouldn't get clearance. And that's really, that to me sounds like someone involved in the secret services interfering with our democracy, which I think is fundamentally wrong. So I've said it all. What do you think?
I think it was to be expected. The Daily Mail and the Sun, the Daily Express, are very strongly pro-Brexit, and they think Theresa May will deliver the hardest Brexit, which is what they want. And actually, as you've said yourself, because Labour's position is more nuanced or more complicated, therefore they do not want a Corbyn government. And so that's why they've pulled out all the stops at the end to say very clearly that actually Corbyn's not fit to lead the country. Now, of course, a lot of the British public don't share that view.
As indeed it's been shown in this election. Catherine, we need to stop it there. Thank you. In a nutshell then, Brexit goes ahead. It's a question of how the negotiations go, and it really looks like we don't know exactly how that's going to pan out. Questions. Let's hope we find some answers. Catherine Barnard, Professor of EU Law at Cambridge, thank you very much indeed. I know you're itching to get back in, so I'll hand you back.
Catherine Barnard and Mark Owen there in central London in the shadow of Big Ben at the heart of Westminster. Thank you very much for that update. For those of you just tuning in, you're watching live from Paris here on France 24. A quick recap for you of our top story this hour. The current exit poll suggests that Theresa May's ruling Conservative Party has fallen short of an absolute majority in this Thursday's general election, bagging in those current estimations just 314 seats in Parliament. These are the latest live pictures. Vote counting underway across the country from the very north of Scotland down to the southwest coast in Cornwall. We are expecting results to trickle in throughout the night. But of course, if we add up the results from Labour, the Liberal Democrats and the SNP, we have a very similar results to the number of seats bagged by the Conservative Party, meaning we could see a coalition led by the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, who's surged in popularity in recent weeks. Agnes from the University of Burgundy, thank you very much for being with us again. What kind of Prime Minister, though, would Jeremy Corbyn make, do you think?
A very unlikely Prime Minister, I think. Is quite seen as a radical left-wing 1980s Labour leader, stuck in the 1980s in a way with nationalisations of public services, the railways, for example. He was part of the Stop the War coalition too, so he has this background of anti-militarism. So he's clearly can be seen as unfit for the job. But
he was seen a few weeks ago as being this, as I was saying earlier, very manic, far left, crazy, far too left candidate to ever be a credible leader. But in recent weeks, he's kind of, either his team have said to him, calm down and change your position, because he has become more and more of a credible politician.
Yes, probably. But it's very hard to believe that he's going to be the kind of centrist, consensual prime minister that is expected of this kind of post. So.
And Yves Irvine, in terms of leaders in Brussels, how would they like to see Jeremy Corbyn at their table in Brexit negotiations?
Well, ideally with a strong backing from a government and a parliament in the UK, which, no matter how you look at these exit polls, looks unlikely unless they once again go to another general election. It would take at least 3 different parties to form a coalition, looking at things stand. And parties that, ran a campaign very differently when it comes to the EU question. You're the 2 main parties, the Tory and Labour, saying that they were going for a Brexit, either a hard or a soft one, and the parties now they would have to go into coalition with did the exact opposite, said they wanted to hold another referendum on that EU question and the deal that the UK would get with the EU.
OK, that's sadly all we have time for now. Do stay with us here on France 24, our coverage of the aftermath as the results trickle in from the UK following Thursday's general election. Do stay with us here on France 24. I'm back with more coverage after this very short break.